Okay. Well, tonight I just wanted to kind of go over briefly the review guide, just so that way if you have any questions about what's on it, kind of know what to expect for the test, and then really just help you guys with questions. So if you have any homework questions or anything about 5, 6, and 7, we can kind of go over that, and you guys can work. A little time to work. Okay, here we go. So I did go through the test, and it's actually 38 questions now. I got rid of a few that were confusing or long or both. So, you're welcome. I was like, what is that even asking? You know, it's like, I can't tell. No. Took me a while to figure it out, and then I think I got it set to where it should ask you in order, like chapter 5 and then 6 and then 7. Because sometimes in these they kind of overlap, and so it's like, what is it even, you know, is it asking me stuff like this, or am I doing something harder? So hopefully that'll help a little bit. So it is still a multiple choice though. I think I put the time limit at like 3 hours. It shouldn't take you that long, but that's just, you know, if you need to look things up or kind of review something. I think the average time's a little over an hour, like an hour 15, hour 20 to complete it. So I give yourself at least an hour and a half dedicated to it, just to make sure. And then obviously, like on the terminology, those are pretty easy. I got rid of a couple things that we didn't really talk about, even though it was in your book, so you could look it up. We didn't talk about it, so I think I got that. But chapter 5, as far as terminology, you know, we talked about the difference between job costing and process costing. So some of your questions will really just be like, which of these companies uses or should use job costing and which should use process costing? So, you know, just kind of know the difference and which is better in which situation. And then, you know, we talked about an actual overhead rate, activity levels. I think that's what I got rid of. And then really the big thing in chapter 5 was knowing inventory flows. You know, like we purchase materials, so those get debited to materials. And then when those materials get requisitioned to jobs, they move out of materials and debited into work in process. You know, your work in process is then when you put in your labor as well as those materials, you apply your overhead, you know. So just kind of understand, and that's kind of a review really, right? We were still doing that in chapter 4, but you know, just following a job through that process. So just understand those inventory accounts and how the jobs flow through them. And you know, which one you would debit and credit. So if we purchase materials, obviously, you know, you're debiting materials. So just understand those. Know a little bit about the overhead control account. The biggest thing I would know there, you know, is just, of course, we use it to keep track of actual versus applied overhead. You know, all of your actual overhead costs get debited to it and your applied gets credited. And then you would look at the balance to see if you were over or under applied. So just kind of understand that. I think chapter 5 was pretty straightforward. I think everyone, unless you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think everyone did pretty well. And it was like before spring break. And I think everyone was pretty solid on chapter 5. So those are just some terminology things to review. Like I said, I think I got rid of activity levels because we didn't really talk about that. So as far as calculating, you know, be able to calculate job costs. So if they give you several jobs and tell you this job actually was finished, you know, make sure you do labor, materials, any applied overhead, any beginning costs that it had, you know, just kind of review that. Be able to calculate applied overhead using a plant-wide rate. So again, that's kind of a review from a previous chapter as well. So, you know, you just take your budgeted overhead divided by your activity driver to get, you know, like that overhead rate if they don't give it to you. And then you would apply it based on usually direct labor, right? Labor hours. So you want to review that. Again, just understand journal entries. to add materials, labor, finished goods, you know, requisitioning those into work in process. Balance inventory accounts. So basically that just means, you know, being able to tell me end work in process or what's ending in finished goods. You know, just balancing those two accounts. And then calculate cost of goods sold. Okay. So as long as you understand, again, I think chapter 5 is probably just good to review it, just, you know, to remember what we covered. But I don't think any of it was too difficult. It's just keeping it fresh, right? When it's been a few weeks, it's like, oh yeah, we did do that. Seems like a long time ago. So any questions over chapter 5? And, you know, again, you can use your notes on the test because a lot of them, you know, are going to be calculations anyway. So feel free to use those notes. Then we moved into chapter 6, which was all process costing. So that one got a little trickier because we had to deal with equivalent units of production. And then, you know, units transferred in, units completed, you know, started and completed. So some of those questions, they're not hard. It's just make sure you read them, you know, as far as what it's asking. Do they want what was completed or what was started and completed? You know, sometimes it just asks you for different things. So some of the questions are truly just giving you some numbers and saying how many were completed in the period. And then, you know, there may be another question on computing equivalent units of production. I think the hardest part in chapter 6 was just doing the actual first in, first out, you know, method to account for units. So just review that compared to your weighted average. And again, on the test questions, just make sure you read through. I'm not having you do any really long ones where you're doing that whole production, you know, like figuring out from the beginning to the end, calculating unit costs or anything like that, but just little snippets of things. Okay, so just make sure you review. Again, really focusing on FIFO and weighted average, just understanding how to compute equivalent units for both like ones that are started, you know, like beginning work in process and ending work in process. So if you remember, the biggest thing, one was number 1, make sure you read, because sometimes materials will be added 100% at the beginning. So, you know, they'll be 100% as far as completion goes with materials, if materials are added at the beginning. So just be mindful of that. And then number 2, with the difference between FIFO and weighted average, just remember FIFO, you don't consider past period costs. So remember, when you're counting equivalent units of production, if you're trying to finish what was started last period, you disregard the costs that were started last period. Okay? So you would calculate the cost to finish what was in beginning work in process. Okay? So that was the big difference. Because in weighted average, we consider all the period costs, like including ones, you know, that are in work in process from last period. So, you know, as far as terminology though, again, FIFO is more accurate because you're only considering current period costs. You're not looking at costs that were transferred in from last month or last year or whatnot. Okay. And then as far as what to calculate, it looks like a lot, but a lot of it's kind of repetitive, I guess you could say, or pretty easy. So be able to tell me what was completed and transferred out to another department. Again, they may give you beginning work in process and what was in the ending, you know, just being able to calculate that. So those are pretty easy. Total units to account for, you know, so that's when you could come up with it either way, right? It's like ending work in process plus what was completed are total units, or beginning work in process plus what was started. So either way, it depends on what info they give you. You can calculate units to account for. So again, some of these are pretty easy, and then it just gets a little bit difficult. And so with that same thing here, these are all kind of related, calculating units completed. And then as well, really number 5 kind of ties in calculating units started and completed. So those were just all in your production reports. But again, now they'll just be little snippets. So they'll give you some information and you'll just tell them what that is. be able to calculate equivalent units. So again, they'll look at both materials and conversion, which conversion is your labor and overhead. So if they tell you, we started with this many, we completed this many, just remember to always add in what was started and completed at 100%, and then just calculate your ending work in process, okay? Under weighted average, especially. So that's a big one. Units started and completed. Unit costs for materials and conversion. I think that's one I took off. Memory serves. I'll have to look here in a minute. Pretty sure it is. And then the big ones, these are a little harder. Being able to calculate equivalent units under the FIFO method versus the weighted average. So again, just read your notes and follow through. Make sure. I think sometimes it's just like reading the question a couple of times. Making sure it's FIFO or weighted average to know which one you're doing. So review equivalent units. And then unit cost of materials under FIFO. I think they give you quite a bit of that information, and then you're just calculating the unit cost under FIFO. So again, the big thing with FIFO is whenever costs are in beginning work in process, you don't consider, right? So you just want to calculate how many units or how many materials it would take to finish those in beginning work in process. So that's kind of the biggest part of FIFO. So those get a little tricky, but I think you guys did pretty well in chapter 6. Any questions on chapter 6? On those, just read the questions really carefully. If it's asking you units completed and not units started and completed, sometimes it just gets tricky because of the wording. So just read those really carefully. There's a lot of different things to account for in that one. You guys good so far? Okay. So last chapter, probably the hardest one, right? Good old applying different methods. So as far as terminology goes, understand the difference between support departments and production departments. Again, the whole goal of chapter 7 is to take all the costs in support departments and put them into the production departments so they actually cover the costs. Understand departmental overhead rates. You may just, make sure you understand the terminology behind that. That's really when we were calculating those allocation rates, things became departmental, as far as how we're applying support departments to the production departments. So instead of having like a plant-wide rate that we always apply, overhead at 20% of direct labor, each department is getting a different allocation. So that's really all I mean when I say departmental overhead rates. So just understand that. And then obviously understanding the difference between plant-wide and departmental, which plant-wide is what we did up until chapter 7. And then really understanding joint cost allocation. That was like the last problem we did as an example with like the weighted apples and everything. And then understand the different cost allocation methods. So just be able to tell the difference between the direct, sequential, and reciprocal. Again, one of the biggest things is that reciprocal is the most difficult, but the most accurate because you're applying all the costs to all the other departments. So you're getting a more accurate cost representation. And then as far as what you need to know to calculate, well, you'll calculate indirect costs using an activity driver. So really, that was more of the plant-wide overhead rate, right, when you're only doing one activity driver. I'm pretty sure I took the dual charging rate off of there, so don't worry about that one. That's when you had a variable rate and then a fixed amount that you were allocating. So you can line through that one. You will not do a dual charging rate. And then you will apply costs using direct. And then there's one applying using sequential. But it was just 2 departments. I know the homework, there was one that had like 3 departments, kind of 3 guys. It'll just be 2 departments, 2 support departments. And then just understand like how to establish the cost equation under reciprocal. You won't have to do a reciprocal one on there. It's kind of lengthy and time consuming. you know, to write those accounting equations and do all the math, but be able to just write the equations. So if you're given the allocations, like they'll give you the allocations in the table, and you'll just say like GF equals, you know, 100,000 plus 0.1 R or whatever, okay? So just understand how to read the cost allocations and develop the equations from that. So you won't have to calculate the cost. But you will apply costs with the direct and sequential method. Those are a little shorter, especially direct, it's pretty easy. I think the only thing it's like, okay, just gotta make sure I'm reading the chart right? Any questions on chapter 7? You guys good? Any questions in general about the test or anything? Okay, well, you guys, awesome. All gonna make 100 then, right? Yeah. Like I said, though, the rest of the time, really, I just wanted to make sure we kind of read through that and went over it. If you had any questions, kind of letting you know I did take out a couple too that I didn't find as important or we didn't cover. I think there were some in there. I made the test kind of longer because last year they were asking me for no time limit. And so I made the test harder. And I was like, sure. But you guys all did pretty well. Like the first test went really well, so I'm not really worried with time. So I gave you plenty of time so you wouldn't worry about time. But, you know, I don't anticipate taking me 3 hours to do the test. But I know some people like to double check and reassure, and that's fine. So if you want to spend 3 hours, you know, hey, go for it, right? So that's why I went through and took out some ones that maybe were a little tricky that I threw at them. Because if you're going to get unlimited time, you know, how to make it a little harder, right? Any questions? Yes, ma'am.
One thing that always gets me, hope it doesn't, we'll have to set it, is the rounding.
Yes.
So, is there something, okay, so when you do the first, you need to round it to 4, and you point 2, 4, 5, 6, 8.
Mm-hmm.
Are we supposed to take and round it right then and there, or take that whole 5-digit? I mean, I don't want to look it up in the book, but what do we take times from 85,000?
Okay, yeah, round it. Yes, yeah. So like when you're doing your allocation ratios, yeah, go ahead and round it to the 4 digits and use that. Yeah, so use your rounded amounts to calculate. Oh, yeah. It's like, which one?
Okay.
Yeah, it should tell you too on the test, like round it to 4 or 3 or whatever. 4 is kind of the default though, I believe, in this text, but yeah, sometimes yeah, the rounding gets tricky. Well, because then sometimes they're like, don't round your intermediate calculations, you know, it's like, yeah. Yeah, we deal with that a lot in payroll too, because it's like, if you round your intermediate calculations, and I mean, it might just be like 2 cents, but you know, 2 cents is, yeah, it gets tricky. It does. So yeah, and this one I would just always round the allocation before you do the allocation. Yeah, and I warn people too, like if you use Excel to calculate, be careful, because that's where some students got off too, is they were using an Excel spreadsheet. And that's great, you know, because you can do some quick calculations. And you might tell it to only display 4 decimals, but it's keeping that whole number in there. So unless you use a round function and actually round it off, when you do your next calculation, it could be wrong because Excel didn't know to round it. So you're only seeing the 4 decimals, but it's still all there. So that's something we don't really think about. And then that was more in payroll, but I could see it in cost too being an issue if you ever pull up an Excel spreadsheet to do some calculations. So yeah, be careful with that. Rounding gets tricky. And I wish they would just adopt like an across the board policy, like don't round intermediate account, you know, or round them and always round to this many decimals and make life easier. Any other questions?
That's true.
Isn't it true?
Can you kind of go over 7 and 8 on the homework?
Yeah, like
I'm
the.
having issues with the ratios on the, just the bottom level.
Kind of hard. Let's see, I have it open.
I think I could figure it out from there. It's just,
Like trying to get
yeah,
the.
I guess I'm missing a number or adding a number that I shouldn't be adding into the total, and it's not. Like everything I've tried is not right.
So number 7. Of course, my numbers are different, but we can kind of look at it. So on the allocations, or
Yes.
okay, so that one's a little tricky because you're doing the step, right? The sequential, but you have 3 support, right? Like so power, general factory, and purchasing are all 3 support departments, right? So what you want to do, I think they told you highest to lowest. So you'll start with the general factory like you did in our practice one or like the other homework. And so general factory will get applied to all 4 others. Did you get that one? Okay. Yeah, most people get that one. And then the next one, I think is you apply purchasing next, right? Because it's the second highest. So purchasing will get, and it's based on purchase order, so that's line 3 here. Purchasing gets applied to power and then the 2 production. And that's because you don't want to apply any purchasing into general factory because you've already allocated general factory. Okay, so purchasing gets allocated to power and then your 2 production. So it would just be based on those 3 purchase order amounts. Okay. And then your last one, power, doesn't get applied to any of the support because they've already been allocated. So then power, you would just look at pesticide and fertilizer. Does that help?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, that one's tricky. I had a few emails on that one. Does that make sense to everyone? Yeah, it's a little different. And then the last one, you're doing the reciprocal. So on that one, were you having difficulties coming up with the allocation ratios or the actual?
It was the allocation ratios, but only, no.
Oh, no, you're fine.
Okay, no, on this one it was the allocation. So
Okay.
I have all the ratios.
Okay. So that's where you're writing your cost equations, right? So you should have, like basically it should look kind of like, I know this one's, my numbers are different, but you should be doing where you're writing your 2 cost equations and then putting one into the other.
So I just got a bunch of question marks. I don't remember I got lost.
Somewhere along the way.
So I had,
So you had all of your allocations, okay, and you can direct costs. Okay, so yeah, that's when you have to like write those cost formulas, like this. So you would establish 2 cost functions, and then you put like this one into that equation.
okay, maybe I just did it.
Yeah, because I don't think on the other one, I think they asked you for the cost equations first and then had you solve.
Okay.
So there you're having to do it all. Okay. So when you solve, you'll be solving for total costs for general factory and then you'll allocate based on it.
Okay.
I can help you with the costs.
Okay. Thank you.
Anyone else have questions on the 7 homework? Anything? I know those last 2 were kind of tricky. Okay.